So, New Historicism emerged in the 1980s as a significant challenge to the dominant formalist approach, particularly in the United States. It marked a decisive, historical and ideological turn in literary studies, meaning it shifted the focus towards understanding literature in its historical and cultural context. Instead of viewing texts as isolated or timeless, New Historicism seeks to reconnect the aesthetic object with the actual currents of historical life, making it more relevant and dynamic. Unlike previous methods that treated literature as an eternal essence, this movement analyzes texts as socio-political discourses, ways in which power, culture, and society are reflected and contested. It's often seen as a space where conflict and negotiation happen, moving beyond just aesthetic appreciation and into broader cultural inquiry. Overall, it represents a shift towards understanding literature as part of the complex web of history, politics, and ideology. So, when we talk about the new in New Historicism, we're really highlighting a radical departure from what we call old historicism. Now, the older approach, represented by figures like E.M.W. Tilliard, aimed to find a kind of unified spirit of the age or a harmonious worldview that connected literature with the broader historical context. But the new historicists challenge that idea completely. They see historical periods not as smooth, continuous narratives, but as sites filled with discontinuities and contradictions. Instead of a single, stable history, they argue that history is actually a tapestry of multiple competing stories, nothing objective or fixed about it. This perspective forces us to rethink the relationship between literature and history. Rather than viewing history as a backdrop for literary works, New Historicists see it as an active, foregrounded interaction, an ongoing dialogue. In essence, this shift signifies a move away from a fixed, overarching view of history and toward understanding it as a series of diverse, sometimes conflicting narratives that shape and are shaped by literature. So, a key idea in New Historicism is that history isn't just a straightforward record of past events. Instead, it's always narrated, meaning that our understanding of history is shaped through stories, representations, and texts. Because of this, history becomes textualized or turned into a kind of text that we interpret. Now, the important thing to remember here is that we never have direct access to the past in a pure, unfiltered form. We can only reach the past through the representations left behind, those archival materials, documents, and cultural artifacts. These are the texts that shape how we understand what happened. This idea links closely with post-structuralist thought, which argues that reality itself is constructed through discourse. In other words, reality is always already textual, meaning it's always mediated and shaped by language and texts. For the new historicist, then, a poem or a novel isn't just a window into a historical truth. Instead, it's a material event, something that happens in its own right, with its own historical significance. So the core concept here is the textuality of history, the understanding that history is always mediated through texts, narratives, and representations, and that these are essential to how we interpret the past. This perspective invites us to see literary works as active participants in history, not just reflections of it. The movement we're discussing today draws heavily on the ideas of Michel Foucault, who saw history not as a smooth, continuous story, but as a series of disconnected, discursive practices. Essentially, he believed that institutions shape what can be said and known through discourse. They set rules and procedures that determine what is acceptable to talk about in any given time period. These rules form what Foucault called an archive, which is like a positive unconscious. They influence our understanding of what's normal and what counts as a subjectivity. In other words, the archive is this underlying structure that shapes our perceptions and identities without us even realizing it. Now, applying these ideas, New Historicism looks at how social power is embedded in everyday life. It traces how power influences the process of living and how it's reflected in cultural practices and texts. So, when we talk about Foucault and the archive, we're really exploring how our knowledge, norms, and identities are shaped by these discursive structures governed by power. It's a way to see history and culture as dynamic, interconnected, and always influenced by the underlying mechanisms of power and discourse. Foucault emphasized that social and political power operates through what he called discursive formations. These are structures rooted in institutions like the clinic, the prison, and the school. These formations are not just abstract ideas, they shape how we understand ourselves and society. They impose dichotomies. Think about the distinctions like sanity versus madness, or sexual normality versus abnormality. These categories are powerful because they influence social organization and control how individuals are perceived and treated. Importantly, Foucault argued that power is not centralized or held by a single individual. Instead, power is more like an impersonal, pervasive force, what he called the will to knowledge. It's this ongoing, diffused force that sustains social norms and discourses. This is where the new historicists come into play. They look at how literary texts reflect and reproduce these discourses. Literature, in this sense, acts out these societal concerns, renewing and reinforcing the powerful systems of knowledge and control that shape our world. So overall, this slide highlights how discursive formations and institutional power are intertwined, influencing everything from individual identity to societal structures, all within the broader theme of how power operates in subtle, yet profound, ways. So, building on Louis Althusser's ideas, new historicists argue that individuals are interpellated, or haled into specific subject positions by ideological discourses. Essentially, this means that society's beliefs and power structures call us into certain roles, shaping how we see ourselves. This process subjects the individual, which suggests that the human subject is no longer seen as the original source or creator of meaning. Foucault and other theorists take this further by decentering the subject. They see the human subject as a product of intersecting psychic, sexual, and linguistic mechanisms, things that influence us from multiple angles, rather than a fixed, autonomous self. Stephen Greenblatt adds an important point here. He argues that in historical documents, there are no moments of pure, unfettered subjectivity. Instead, every subject is an ideological product shaped by power relations. So overall, these ideas challenge the notion of a stable, autonomous individual, emphasizing how our identities are constructed through complex relationships with power, language, and culture. This connects directly to our theme of understanding how identity and power are intertwined in historical and cultural contexts. So, what we're seeing here is how new historicism expanded its critical toolkit by borrowing from anthropology, specifically from Clifford Geertz. Geertz is famous for developing the concept of thick description, which is really about analyzing cultural details and small events as if they are complex, semiotic texts. This means that instead of just looking at big, obvious symbols, critics can dive into the subtle, everyday practices to uncover deeper meanings. It's almost like reading a text, but instead of words on a page, we're reading the social fabric itself. By doing this, critics can find what's called a touch of the real, meaning they get closer to understanding how cultural practices and social realities shape the texts we study, whether those texts are literary works or other social phenomena. This approach encourages us to see the entire social landscape as a kind of text to interpret. And importantly, it blurs the traditional hierarchy that places high art above low social practices, suggesting that both are equally rich sources of cultural meaning. So, in essence, Geertz's thick description helps us see beyond surface appearances and appreciate the complex layers of social life that influence literature, and, by extension, our understanding of culture itself. A hallmark of new historicist practice is the use of the illustrative anecdote to skew or disrupt traditional historical narratives. These anecdotes often involve seemingly insignificant phenomena that, when analyzed, can reveal new ways of understanding the past. It's fascinating how, by taking an object or an event out of its original context, the collector can retrieve what we might call authentic meanings, meanings that have been obscured or overlooked by the accepted historical wisdom. This technique effectively creates a revisionist history, where the voices of the past are reheard through objects that challenge or contradict the established philosophy. Essentially, the strategy of the anecdote serves as a powerful tool to question and reshape our understanding of history, making it more dynamic and multifaceted. So, a central question for new historicism is just how far literary texts actually offer a radical critique of power, or if they just participate in its containment. This functionalist perspective suggests that established power structures often allow or even encourage what seems like subversion, but really, it's just a way to justify their own rightness and authority. In this view, figures like the mad, the unruly, and the alien are seen as internalized others, as parts of ourselves that are used to reinforce and consolidate dominant identities. Some critics argue that this model can be a bit too pessimistic, implying that power is a closed system with no real space for genuine resistance. This brings us to the idea of the dialectic of subversion and containment, where acts of resistance are often absorbed or neutralized by the very power structures they challenge. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it helps us see how literature interacts with power, not just as a tool for rebellion, but also as a part of the ongoing negotiation between subverting and maintaining authority. Let's talk about Stephen Greenblatt, who's often called the Grand Master of New Historicism. He really explored how the concept of the individual or the subject was understood during the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods. His influential book, Renaissance Self-Fashioning, published in 1980, dives deep into how identity was constructed at that time. He shows that identity wasn't just something inherent. It was shaped by the circulation of social energy and power, meaning the way ideas, values, and authority flowed through society influenced how people saw themselves. Greenblatt's perspective marks a shift from the more optimistic political hopes of his teacher, Raymond Williams, towards a more Foucaultian view, which is quite pessimistic. He saw the human subject as remarkably unfree, heavily influenced and constrained by the social and political structures around them. A key point here is that Renaissance drama often reflects and reinforces the concerns of the monarchy, acting out the central axis of power. It's like the plays were not just entertainment, but also a way to enact and legitimize the social order. So overall, Greenblatt's work helps us understand how identity in the Renaissance was not fixed, but was something actively fashioned through cultural and political forces, which ties into our broader theme of how power and culture shape human experience. In Britain, when New Historicism emerged, a significant response was the development of cultural materialism, a term borrowed from Raymond Williams. Now, while both approaches share some roots in Foucault's ideas, cultural materialism is actually more explicitly radical and deeply connected to socialist traditions. It looks at culture as a material formation, meaning it considers culture not just as ideas or beliefs, but as something concrete with its own modes of production and power effects. It also pays attention to specific audiences and how they engage with cultural products. One of the key differences from New Historicism is that cultural materialism often isn't seen as politically pessimistic. Instead, it maintains what's called a political cutting edge, meaning it's actively interested in social change and transformation. So, this approach is not just about understanding culture, it's about challenging and changing the social structures that produce it. Overall, cultural materialism pushes us to see culture as a site of material struggle, with real implications for social justice and political activism. It's a more radical, action-oriented perspective that aligns with broader socialist ideals, aiming for meaningful social change. Today, I want to talk about Raymond Williams's influential work, Marxism and Literature from 1977, which really laid the groundwork for what we now call cultural materialism. Williams had a very broad and nuanced view of culture. He defined it as a whole way of life, encompassing everything from beliefs and practices to social institutions. One of the key ideas he introduced is the concept of hegemony. This is a crucial term because it explains how ruling groups maintain power, not just through force, but by shaping what we see as common sense. Essentially, they create a structure of consent, making their worldview seem natural or inevitable, so people accept it without much question. Williams also made an important distinction within culture itself, dividing it into residual, dominant, and emergent elements. This helps us understand that society isn't a simple, unified whole. Instead, it's constantly in flux, with different cultural elements coexisting and competing. This dynamic model opens up space for us to explore subversive or marginalized voices that still persist within the dominant order, challenging the idea of a static or monolithic culture. Connecting this to our overall theme, Williams's ideas remind us that culture is always active and contested. It's not just a backdrop, but a site where power and resistance play out, a concept that's central to understanding how ideology and social change operate. Cultural materialists like Jonathan Dollimore and Alan Sinfield argue that every history of subjection also contains a history of resistance. What they mean is that resistance isn't just a reaction to being oppressed, it's actually a fundamental part of how power operates. Resistance signals an ineradicable difference, a kind of pushback that keeps the door open for change, even in the face of domination. They focus a lot on the idea of appropriations of cultural representations. This means that meanings aren't fixed or set in stone. Instead, they can be reinterpreted or seized upon for radical purposes. For example, Shakespearean plays can be rewritten against the grain, so to speak, to highlight socialist ideas or expose the tragedy faced by the common people, the plebs. So this concept of resistance and appropriation is crucial because it shows how cultural texts aren't just passive reflections. They can be actively used to challenge existing power structures and create new meanings. It's a powerful reminder that culture is always more dynamic and contestable than it might seem at first glance. In the 1980s and 90s, we see a new wave of historicism emerging, challenging the earlier focus on romanticism that deconstructionist approaches often emphasized. Critics like Marilyn Butler, Jerome McGann, and Marjorie Levinson aimed to restore what they called contemporary meanings to literary works. They believed that these works were shaped by what they called ideological trouble spots, which could obscure their true significance. To navigate this, they employed a concept called the historical imagination, which allowed them to interpret a work in ways that neither its original author nor its original readers could have fully understood. Essentially, they tried to resituate texts within a complex discursive frame, moving beyond the simple text and context dichotomy that older scholarship often relied on. This approach helped us see Romanticism not just as a historical period, but as a dynamic, evolving conversation embedded within larger cultural and ideological frameworks. Today, I want to talk about a significant challenge that historicism is currently facing. This challenge comes from what's called the end of history thesis. Essentially, this idea suggests that liberal democracy and the free market represent the final stages of rational state development. Thinkers like Francis Fukuyama argue that history, in a sense, has reached its triumphant conclusion, making any major historical changes impossible from this point forward. This perspective creates a crisis for historicism because it questions the idea that history is something dynamic and ongoing. But in response, new historicists are rediscovering the importance of aesthetics. They emphasize how literature and cultural expression can still regenerate and revive our sense of history, especially when it feels threatened or stagnant. They also point out that our current postmodern condition, living in a kind of global Disney world that often seems superficial, demands that we re-engage with the real relations of history. In other words, they believe that understanding our true historical context is more important than ever, especially amid the distractions and illusions of modern life. So the core idea here is that while the end of history thesis challenges traditional historicist views, it also pushes us to reconsider how we connect with history, culture, and literature in a world that often feels disconnected from its past. Recently, historicist criticism has been shifting towards what we might call the aftermathic and spectral time, where the past is not simply gone, but continues to inhabit the present like a ghost. It's as if history haunts us, lingering in the background and influencing our current experiences. Jacques Derrida's book, Spectres of Marx from 1993, really popularized this idea of hauntology. He argues that texts, especially in literature and philosophy, contain traces of foreign bodies, elements that act like hauntings, unresolved and persistent. These traces aren't just remnants, they actively shape meaning and understanding. This spectral turn encourages us to see the canon, not as fixed monuments of the past, but as voices that are disembodied yet still calling out across an open space. Think of it as voices echoing from different times, never fully silenced, never fully settled. In this perspective, nothing is ever truly laid to rest. Instead, we live in the shadow of an endlessly recurring past, which continues to influence and shape our present realities. It's a fascinating way to understand how history and memory operate in culture and thought today. New historicists have played a really important role in broadening our understanding of the Western cultural canon. They've worked to include voices and texts from marginalized and often excluded groups, which challenges the traditional ideas of what counts as literature or cultural value. By doing this, they've questioned the usual benchmarks we use to judge literary worth. In American studies, for example, they've highlighted popular and genre fiction, like sentimental novels, which might not always be considered high art, but can actually provide powerful critiques of society. This shows that even entertainment or genre works can have significant social and cultural insights. However, some critics argue that while new historicists do bring attention to these other voices, they sometimes stop short of truly challenging the canon itself. Instead of dismantling the privileged status of the traditional canon, they may only add new perspectives without fundamentally changing the hierarchy of what is considered worthy literature. So overall, new historicism has been crucial in opening up the canon, but there's ongoing debate about whether it goes far enough in redefining what we value in literature and culture. This ties into the broader theme of how we can rethink and expand our understanding of cultural and literary history. Let's explore how feminist and queer theorists use historicist methods to challenge the idea that sexual identity and gender roles are natural categories. Instead, they show us that these are actually cultural constructions shaped over time. For example, Catherine Belsey's concept of cultural history looks at how patriarchal ideology is enacted in scenes from texts like Genesis and Shakespeare. This helps us see how ideas about family values are constructed rather than inherent. Historians of sexuality further analyze how sexual categories shift across different periods, revealing that what we consider normal or abnormal is often fluid and socially produced. They show how marginalized identities are not fixed, but are formed through specific historical processes. And when we look at binary oppositions, like the normal versus the abnormal, we find that these distinctions are actually quite unstable. It's often during moments of writing or subversion that these binaries are challenged, revealing their constructed nature. All of this ties back to our overall theme. Gender, sexuality, and historicist subjectivity remind us that identities are dynamic, contextual, and open to critique. Despite its brash theoretical buoyancy, new historicism hasn't gone uncriticized. Critics like Edward Said and Terry Eagleton have pointed out that this approach tends to focus more on texts rather than on concrete social or historical realities. In other words, they argue that it can sometimes overlook the larger social contexts that shape history. Additionally, some see the movement's rejection of big-picture, macro-historical schemes as a bit problematic, almost too close to conservative thought, which also tends to dismiss broad social change. Another important critique is that by concentrating heavily on textual phenomena, new historicism risks falling into what's called unhistorical formalism. This means it can sometimes expand literature's influence so much that it swallows up history itself, making history seem less real and more just part of a literary universe. All of these critiques highlight the ongoing debate about how best to understand literature's relationship to history and society. Now, the moment of theory has given way to a range of different approaches, including what we call cognitive historicism. This perspective uses neuroscientific models to challenge traditional dualistic ideas in early modern thought. Essentially, cognitive historicists look for provocative analogies between post-Freudian and pre-Freudian theories of mind, revealing how ideas about consciousness and mental processes have evolved over time. As theory becomes more clearly situated, it still offers a systematic way to reflect on our underlying assumptions, how we see and interpret the world around us. Ultimately, what new historicism encourages us to do is maintain critical vigilance. It pushes us to open up the apparent contradictions and gaps, what we call aporias, in dominant master narratives. This process helps us see the world from new, different perspectives, challenging us to think beyond traditional stories and interpretations. Looking ahead, the future of historicism involves embracing this ongoing complexity. It's about staying curious, questioning assumptions, and recognizing that our understanding is always evolving. It's a reminder that the way we interpret history and culture is never fixed, but always open to new insights and critical engagement.